زن، زندگی، آزادی.
ملت ایران، ملت ایران، این صدای انقلاب ایران است.
صحبت از ایران، برای ایران،
از مردم برای مردم.
چه باید کرد تا گفتگوی ملی شکل بگیره؟
آیا بدون گفتگوی ملی دموکراسی در ایران ممکنه؟
I would like to introduce the new panel, Foreign Policy on Iran, What is it and where is it headed? And I would like to introduce our next moderator for this panel, Negar Mojtahedi, who is journalist and award-winning documentary filmmaker. Please.
Can I climb up?
I want to sit there.
No, I knew it.
I want to sit on the extreme. Are you going to sit there?
Yes.
Sat on this. That was pleasurable. Oh my God! Now I got to see this stuff.
Hello? Okay, there we go. Should I start? Okay. So, hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Negar Mojtahedi, and I am joined by Eyre. He is a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute. He was the State Department's first Persian language spokesperson under President Obama. I suggest you go onto YouTube. He's got a whole, somebody made a 12-minute video of him speaking Farsi with like all the Persian poetry and idioms. So if you haven't checked it out, he has it, I would. And he was also part of the negotiating team as well for the nuclear deal. We've got Behnam Taleblu. He is a senior director of the FDD's Iran program, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Elks, Vatanka, senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And thank you to you guys and people joining us over the live stream as well. Today, we'll explore competing visions of Iran's foreign policy, what a, quote unquote, wise Iran foreign policy looks like, and how Iran may reposition itself after the 12-day war, as well as the role, if any, of the diaspora and of international players. So let's begin. Let's start our conversation with U.S. foreign policy. Since the start of Trump's second term, there was a push for diplomacy. In fact, talks were set to happen on day 63 between the Iranians and Special Envoy Witkoff out of that 60-day deadline that Trump had for the nuclear deal. And I believe that strikes happened on day 61. So how would you define U.S. Foreign policy towards Iran at the moment? And do you see it evolving in any way? Alex, I'll start with you. That was Behnam's request.
Oh, the easy ones. Well, great. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all and with my good friends here and Negar with you. Look, I would characterize it in the following way. I really don't think there's an American policy on Iran. I might be controversial in saying that. I think there are things the United States doesn't want to see from Iran. We all know what those are, the nuclear issue, missiles, what Iran is doing in the region. But I doubt, and Alan and Behnam can share their insights, I doubt that there is a clear-cut vision in terms of what the Trump administration wants to see in the long term on the question of Iran. Again, I hate to be the guy who brings that kind of a message to a crowd like this. I wish I could say, yeah, I see them thinking hard day and night, there's a plan. I just don't see it. And I look at the basic facts. I look at staff at the State Department. I look at, where the priorities are in terms of other issues that the administration has to wrestle with, Ukraine, tariffs, so on. So, again, this is something that the speakers earlier were talking about. This comes down to what the Iranian people want as well. So how do people in Iran, obviously in the diaspora, get together and push the agenda forward, even though in this case, the Trump administration might be there to hold the hand, if you will, or invest. Look, this issue of Iran has been with us for about half a century.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that was born yesterday. It's going to take a lot of effort to push this thing forward. And when I sit here in Washington, D.C., in the think tank community, I wish I could tell you, yeah, I see a lot of heavy thinking. I see a lot of goodwill on part of many people who can see the appeal, and rightfully so, why an Iran different than Islamic Republic would be such a good news for the people of Iran, for the region, and certainly for U.S. interests. But that's what you want. How do you get to it? That's where the challenge still lies ahead. But let me stop there.
But Alex, if you don't see it as a priority for the Trump administration, if I'm hearing you correctly, do you think that could change potentially? And at this point, as somebody who sits in a think tank in Washington, D.C., are there people reaching out to you at all for advice? I'm just curious to see the level of involvement that the Trump administration has with folks like you guys.
It would be a lie if I said they're reaching out to a lot of folks in D.C. to hear our take on it.
That's telling.
I love to hear what Alan has to say on that, given his decades of experience in government, to the extent that he can share with us what he thinks. But that's not the message, that they're out there, doing a major brainstorming with folks. That's not. In fact, you could make arguments. A lot of agencies that in the past might have played a role in shaping American policy today are kind of parked aside. There's a centralization in some ways that really seems to be striking. Again, that's my take on it. I wouldn't claim, as someone who's writing a book on Iran's Arab strategy, I'm much more preoccupied with what's going on in the region than what's going on in Washington. But that's not my take. That there is a proactive effort going on to shape a new Iran policy. That said, that doesn't mean you can't create that momentum. And the Iranian diaspora, certainly here in the United States, can do things to get the attention of President Trump. We kind of know what his interests are. It's not going to be the sort of things that might have worked 20 years ago, right after 9/11, because this is the time where we, remembering 9/11. It has to be a very different message for a very different president. But I guess my bottom line is there are ways maybe you can try and get his attention, but he has to be creative. And sometimes maybe it might upset some people who might want to focus on human rights and issues of that nature, when President Trump is looking at everything when it comes to foreign affairs, much more, and you've heard the cliche, transactional, what's in it for me? So you have to think hard about, present something to him that looks appealing to him from his vantage point.
All right, and Behnam and Alan, I'd love to get your thoughts too. Yes, please. Yeah, and also wanted to know not only where you think the situation is in terms of the foreign policy agenda right now. Do you see it as not being a priority, as Alex had said? And sitting in a think tank yourself, does the Trump administration or folks within the State Department reach out to you guys for advice and for guidance, which is something in of itself?
It's an excellent question. اول بذار از دوستان مخصوصا از NSG و خود آقای سیامک خان تشکر کنم واسه این کنفرانس و گرد همایی دوستان قدیمی و جدید. واقعا باعث افتخاره و یک دنیا ممنون واسه دعوتتون که دوستان رو دوباره گرد همایی کردین و دعوت کردین روی صحنه. با اجازه بقیه سوالا رو به انگلیسی جواب بدم اگه به بزرگی خودتون ببخشید. Listen, I'm terrified of the I word. I am terrified of the I word, not Iran. Can anyone take a guess what an I word might be with respect to this? No, it's not a country. Inattention or ignorance or
Alan was right.
Here's the real I word. here's the real I word. It's actually it's indifference. Bitavavoti. I'm terrified of indifference on Iran. I think there is an Iran policy. I think the broad sentiments that Alex is mentioning, counter-proliferation, counter-terrorism, counter-missile, these are things that actually didn't begin with Trump. They have about decades of history, of presence. You can go to people, talk to them in the Pentagon, from Obama to Trump to Biden, back to Trump. They believe they've been doing the same mission for 4 very different presidents across decades. They have a large mission set. The challenge now will be actually in the perception of the administration, where in the parlance of the administration, they believe they succeeded. The question really is, after success, what? The president uses the word obliterated or destroyed when it comes to Iran's nuclear program. During term 2, very different from term 1 Trump. The president prioritized the nuclear challenge, whereas term 1, it really was an amalgamated Iran regional, Iran domestic, Iran missile, Iran cyber. It was a ton of stuff on human rights. I think to date now, it's September 12, there are China human rights sanctions by the administration. There are Cuba human rights sanctions by the administration. I don't believe there has been a single Iran human rights designation by this administration. I think that's an own goal of strategic proportions, particularly because of the human rights successes the Trump administration had in term 1 versus term 2 in this space. So I am terrified of indifference. That's the big red light I would flag. The charge is the same charge that both Ali Esasi and Ali Reza Akhundi and Alex Vatanka, and I'm sure other people will charge to you and friends all throughout the rest of the day, today and tomorrow, which is, in the face of this indifference, the onus is on you, the diaspora, to magnify, to amplify, to organize, to be effective. That really is how you get over the indifference and you create a political constituency to win, whatever your definition of win is politically when it comes to Iranian diaspora activity. Now, if we shift from the administration, there is a phrase you may remember actually since 9/11 that almost every American president has been using, and that is all options on the table. I really think in the first 6-7 months of the Trump administration, perhaps more so than any president since 9/11, all options were genuinely on the table. He literally went in every direction. It was NSPM2 in February, the resurrection of the maximum pressure strategy. So that's the sanctions. It was his personal announcement, I believe in early April of 2025, early April of this year. Actually, we were doing an event at FDD. Negar was the moderator. And then moments later, as soon as the event ended, the president broke news that there will be negotiations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So there you go. That's the diplomacy. That's the 5.5 rounds of direct or indirect contact that they had. There was military action, both supportive of Israel as well as offensive against Iran's nuclear facilities. For 23 years, we've been talking about these sites. Now that the president is saying it's obliterated. And there was even, the direction to go potentially, briefly, in terms of regime change. There was the tweet about MIGA, make Iran great again. So I think the president has staked, actually strategically, I would say, claims about all of these. He's demonstrated at least the willingness to entertain conversations about all of them, about diplomacy, about sanctions, about military force, even about regime change, even taking on his constituency, calling those who opposed his strikes within his own party, kooks and whatever. So I think he may not move again from success to something after indifference because he may not see a win. And that's where the community can be effective. Sood siyasi, to have an actual Iran strategy, to spend your political capital. He stated, put some broad terms, he staked out policies, and I think he's watching and waiting. Politicians have capital. They accrue it or they spend it on something that they believe they can achieve in their own term. And in this case, I don't think at the current moment, when you look at some of the sanctions enforcement that I think could be better, and people like us compared to term 1 versus term 2 thought that there would be more vigorous enforcement of, there is real room, I think, for improvement here. And the fear is that the Islamic Republic can take advantage of the drift or the sense of success, or yes, it's destroyed, don't touch the program, we're good, and just wait 4 years and then rebuild, because we can't afford to give any of us, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or monarchist or whatever your political orientation or disposition, to give the Islamic Republic another lease on life and to say that we outlasted this other American president as well as we have others for the past 4 decades. So that's the great fear I have, and that fear can be born of indifference.
So at this moment in time, do you see indifference?
I'm sensing indifference. I see a little bit, bright lights. What's the saying? I think it's a Israeli Palestinian peace negotiation. I think it was a former Israeli president, who's Israeli prime minister, who said it, that there's light at the end of the tunnel, but there's no tunnel. There's different options at the end, but we have to have the logistical infrastructure to get to that end. And I just don't think the administration in the very short term sees political wins along the way. And again, it's the job of Congress, it's the job of activists, the job of analysts, if they believe there is a political win, to help the administration get there.
So Alan, how would you define then U.S. foreign policy towards Iran at the moment, and if you see it changing in any way, evolving? It's on now. It should be.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
you're
sweet
good.
goodness. How do I see U.S.-Iran policy, and do I see it changing? I'll answer the second one first. Yeah, of course it's going to change. Everything changes. Even just, the recent Israeli strike in Qatar changes things. So that's the easy question. How do I see U.S.-Iran policy? We're in a good place. Again, I'm retired. I'm not speaking for the U.S. government. I don't have lines of communication into those people who are making U.S.-Iran policy. But as far as I can tell, based on experience and what limited intelligence I have, we're feeling warm and fuzzy. President Obama, as you've said, has extracted maximum political capital from U.S. participation on the strikes in Iran. We've declared the Iranian nuclear threat obliterated. President Trump, yeah, President Trump, what did I say? Did I? MashaAllah. Piri nasiyan miyade dige. Mazarat mikham. Yeah, sometimes I don't know where I am.
Slip.
No, not Freud. Yeah. Anyway, President Trump. So yeah, I think we're in a good place. I mean, President Trump, when I say President Trump, I mean the executive branch apparatus that does foreign policy. There sees very little upside in trying to engage with the Iranian administration unless they accept what I have to assume are the demands we have on the table, which is no indigenous enrichment in Iran, limitations on their missile program, limitations on support for proxies. If Iran wants to do that, great. I'm sure the U.S. government's eager to accept their, unconditional surrender. But yeah, I agree. What's the upside to engage with Iran for the Trump administration when at least it sees the problem is solved? Now, Israel, that's another story. And to a large extent, the U.S. government has now outsourced its Iran policy to Israel.
So can you elaborate? What do you mean by we're in a good place? What did you mean by that exactly?
We're in a good place in that we are where we want to be. In the sense that President Trump believes that he has taken the Iranian nuclear threat off the table, which is true at least for the remainder of his term, probably. Even if Iran gets out of bed tomorrow and says, sweet goodness, I want a nuclear weapon, probably won't happen before the end of this administration. So as a practical matter, this administration has dealt with the problem, right? And in a policy environment with a very limited attention span, especially for foreign policy issues, especially as midterm elections come up, especially as there's so many contentious and polarizing domestic issues that they prefer to focus on. The Trump administration has very few calories to devote to Iran because it has no need to. Ukraine, maybe, but even there's no win. Gaza, certainly no win there. So blow up a Venezuelan ship and says it has drugs on it. That's a nice win, right? Didn't take too much effort. So I don't see the U.S. trying to engage in negotiations with Iran unless, of course, it's for Iran to, as I said, accept U.S. terms that are already on the table.
So then what are some of the risks of what you've just described, Alan? Risks associated with that?
Well, longer term,
longer term, yeah,
Iran could well decide that whereas before the Israeli attack, we didn't want to build a nuclear weapon, we just wanted to be really close to build one if we needed to.
As deterrence?
As deterrence. Now, given that all the other legs in our strategic stool for deterrence have been obliterated, support for proxies, missiles, their air defense system is largely gone. Yeah, maybe it makes sense to have a nuclear weapon because we've seen, as in the case of North Korea, that if you have nuclear weapons, the U.S. is limited in what it can do. I think Iran believes there is strategic deterrence in having a nuclear weapon. We can argue about that, but I think that's what Iran believes. And again, Iran is a rejectionist power, right? Its goal is not to play well with others, or at least many others, okay? It makes great sounds about, regional cooperation, but Iran wants to be a regional hegemon in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. stands in its way. So Iran is, especially weak and in a place where it doesn't want to be. Conversely, as I said, for all practical purposes, considering that politics to include foreign policy is the art of the possible, we're pretty much gotten all we're going to get out of engaging on the Iran issue.
So if Iran is weak, then I would assume that the opposite of that would be, well, then I want to try and be strong. So would this push them closer then towards an incentive to get that bomb, as you were saying? I wanted to ask Alex and Behnam, and I know that, yes, obviously in the short term, they may not have the capabilities to do so, but if Iran, if you think of them as a strategic long-term player, what do you guys think? Alex, I'll start with you and then Behnam.
Sorry, get the question to me one more time briefly.
So would this push them more towards acquiring the bomb, not as deterrence,
Right.
but actually having it now? Did this push them in the opposite direction?
My short answer to that would be, if they had to choose between regime survival and the bomb, they'll choose regime survival. They won't mess around, because if that invites more attacks, the last thing you want to do, I guess, and I'm following up what Alan's saying, the last thing you want to do is to get Trump's attention. Well, you know, why would you want to do that? If you're in the business of survival, and we all know the Islamic Republic cares about survival, it's part of its constitution, it's part of its being. So I think if they could get away with it without being found out, or if they felt, you know, tomorrow, I don't know, give you a hypothetical, Egypt and Israel go to war, suddenly Israel doesn't care about Iran anymore, it creates an opportunity for Iran to dash for the bomb? Maybe. But under the circumstances, and I don't have to tell this crowd how infiltrated Iran is, everything they do is going to be found out by somebody, if not Mossad, then somebody else. So they know the eyes of the world, particularly the ones that care, are on them. They're not going to be able to get away with anything really of significance, certainly not dash for a nuclear bomb, I think, without being found out. And that just raises the stakes. So, you know, deterrence doesn't, outweigh survival. And this is, again, something we all know. Ali Khamenei is, what is he, 87? He just turned 87?
Yep, that's right.
He presumably has to worry about succession and continuity of his regime. I mean, imagine what history will say about Ali Khamenei, the guy who got the deal of the century when he became the supreme leader without having to work for it. And then some 36-7 years later, by the time he died, he squandered it. He gave it all away. The regime that he was, the captain of collapses. He doesn't want that. So in other words, he cares about this passing on the baton to the next person, whoever that might be.
His legacy.
His legacy. And that, so in some ways, I think if you had to choose between getting killed by the Israelis, which I actually think probably it appeals to him in a way, and probably appeals to him a lot more than people think, because that would be his legacy, or survival of the regime, the survival of the regime. The last thing he wants to do is be the guy who shows up or sends an envoy to a nice 5-star hotel in Geneva, and they sign under a dotted line that says Iran will for never, ever enrich uranium, right? That's the last thing he wants to do. Anyway, let me stop there.
Behnam.
Just on the, will they weaponize, or will they?
Yeah, to dash for the bomb and the impact that this could have in the long term, not necessarily short term, for Iranian strategy.
You know, the resurrection of the Iranian nuclear program in the very early 1980s of the Iran-Iraq War, which I don't have to tell you guys the impact of that war, but in the American military and political psyche, it's like World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and the 2003 Iraq War, all rolled up into one in terms of the impact it had on defense, on society, on security, and even the political and military elite who are, unfortunately, still at the helm today. And when a country engages in that kind of total war, it doesn't do things on the science front or on the technology front because it's a science fair project. It does so because it's part of the quest for deterrence. So I think the Islamic Republic, so long as it will be around, will be obsessed with this quest for deterrence. And one of the two mythological weapons from the Iran-Iraq War is the nuclear weapon, is the nuclear quest. Both of these countries bombed each other's nuclear facilities. In the middle, Israel bombed the Iraqi nuclear facility. This stuff still weighs on the strategic calculus of the Islamic Republic. And I fear here that the quest for counterproliferation has actually handicapped the quest for an Iran policy. In fact, ironically, the more technically good we've gotten at counterproliferation, the more politically bad we've gotten at strategically containing and rolling back the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it leaves lots of these good enough options in place. It's good enough to have a JCPOA. It's good enough to have a strike, whereas in reality, the art of the deal, the art of really having an Iran policy that could lead to a situation where you can actually have the people in charge of their own destiny in that country after a very long time, really exists in this in-between and requires a sophisticated and flexible approach. And I fear that now, and I hope I'm wrong, But I fear that now the Islamic Republic actually won't dash for the bomb. There is a lot of noise. There is actually a lot of noise by the ultra hard right in Iran. There was protests outside the Supreme National Security Council just the other day, just like there was from 2003 to 2005 when the E3 was first negotiating with Iran. They're designed to say, hey, there's a hard right. It's classic academic Putnam two-level games. This is straight from game theory. They're trying to say, hey, we can't even give a little bit on the nuclear file. So my fear is not that they would dash, because more so than ever before, these guys know if they dash, given how penetrated they are, that's the trigger for an Israeli strike. My fear is that they lay low. First, they rebuild on the missile. Then they rebuild the homeland defense, particularly air defense. Third, they rearm and re-equip and wait out America and wait out Israel in the region when it comes to the axis of resistance. And then they slowly, both in terms of covert and overt again, especially given where the relationship with the IEA may be in year 2 or year 3 of the Trump administration, that they actually accrue the assets again to be able to make that dash at a time of their own choosing, and that they survive. Khamenei's legacy is not a nuclear weapon. You would not believe how many times I have to say this in Washington audiences. Khamenei's legacy is the survival of the regime. And my charge to policymakers is, don't stop the bomb, stop the regime. If you stop the regime, by ipso facto, you will stop the bomb. But if you focus only on stopping the bomb, you may ironically lock in the regime.
And I guess, Behnam, this goes back to your fear of indifference, that if they feel that this chapter is closed and don't look at the other aspects of it, that will lead to indifference, in which case it would increase the survivability of this regime, which is at its weakest point right now.
One super quick footnote. I don't want to get in Alan's way. I'd love to hear more about this. But politically, it's very odd to me where the Iranians have said all they've said about Trump and all they've done about Trump. They said they would never negotiate with him, and they said there would never be a war. And in the first 6 months of the Trump administration, they both negotiated with him and there was a war. They have been trying to kill him. They've been trying to actually have, threats against the life of his administration officials because of the success of the Qasem Soleimani strike in 2020. And then all of the fatwas after the 12-day war. I am politically perplexed as to how this is not a bigger issue for the Trump administration, and politically for the person of the president, when there are clerics in the Islamic Republic of Iran saying that we can take your wife and daughters as war booty, like issuing sophisticated fiqh, like legal rulings that this is permissible. How is this not part of the national debate about how to counter the Islamic Republic? Because if you have an adversary that is deterred, they would not be saying that. That's why it's a blaring red light for me. And that's why I think it's dangerous to set back and settle for short-term success.
And how, I guess that leads me to my next question. How would you define success then? Let's start with Alan, and then we'll make our way, you and then Alex.
Success in what context?
Success in terms of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy towards Iran. How would you measure success if you were still in the U.S. government right now? What would success look like for you?
The first question I would ask myself is, to what extent is Iran a threat to our national security? Okay, we can all guess the obvious ones. Nuclear weapon, if they had one. ICBMs, nuclear or non-nuclear. And to an extent, and to a lesser extent, the ability of Iran to work against our global interests abroad. Proxy networks, assassination, terrorism, because, as we all know, Iran is a rejectionist power. Again, at the risk of being flippant, to a large extent, we're already there, in the sense that Iran is not a nuclear threat at the moment. I do not think that, as for example Israel does, that in order to deal with the Iranian threat, we need to extirpate the Iranian regime as a whole. There are 193 countries in this world, various degrees of cooperation with the US or opposition to the US, various degrees of odiousness, loathsomeness, evil. Again, given the fact that I take away from my 40 years of government experience how hard it is to effect lasting positive change outside of our own borders in a thoughtful manner, I think that Iran does not pose a short-term, possibly even a medium-term, depending on how you define it, threat to United States vital interests. Doesn't mean we should be indifferent to Iran. We shouldn't be. Again, we have global interests. We need to pay attention all over the world. But it is the fact that now in 2025, Iran is weaker than it has ever been. Will that cause them to either sprint or saunter toward a nuclear weapon? It could well be. Time will tell, and we will have to monitor that, as I am sure Israel, among others, will be monitoring that. But the perfect is the enemy of the good. And as someone who's been in government for a long time, I know the first impulse is to do something, right? Like, there's a problem, we need to do something. Sometimes, distressingly often, in fact, there's not much the United States can do, and should it try to do that, it often makes things worse. You know, Ahmad savab kone kebab shode, you know? So I just don't want kebab. In this sense, I love kebab. Yeah, I don't want a bunch of kebab eaters throwing things at me now. Yeah.
Behnam, then Alex, what?
On how to create a lasting Iran policy.
Or what?
We just had a gentleman with 4 decades of experience say not possible, and someone with 0 minutes should come and say, no. This is the boring stuff that makes policy successful. You know, you need a big idea. The big idea is that the Islamic Republic of Iran has a bigger problem with you than we have a problem with the Islamic Republic of Iran. That whenever given the opportunity, the Islamic Republic of Iran will align resources to go after you because of its strategy, because of its ideology, and because of political opportunities. And then we align costs, resources, and capabilities to offset that. Look at the creation of CENTCOM, something very slowly that happened in the Middle East. I would love to see how in Alex's book, the creation of CENTCOM is one measure of Iran's involvement in the Arab world and how America tries to balance this. You know, in the very short term, how can the Trump administration create a new Iran policy or build a better Iran policy? Is to act on the things that it's declared. If you read this document, NSPM2, it really has the best and the brightest of some of the ideas from term 1 of the Trump administration. The question is, can they create the bureaucracies, the processes, and the constituencies in the government, as well as in their partner countries, to be able to get the most out of it? Here's one measure of, you know, where, again, as a supporter of the big picture things the Trump administration is doing, but with questions as to the logistics, you know, Trump unilaterally tried to snap back UN sanctions in 2020. America's transatlantic partners at the UN laughed. 5 years later, now those transatlantic partners are all on board for snapping back those sanctions. My question is, where is the Trump administration in terms of the logistics of, if snapback happens, how do you ensure that it's a success? You know, how do you make sure that you can win the bureaucratic knife fight at the UNSC against the Russians, against the Chinese, so that once you get back all of the resolutions that Alan remembers vividly, and all of you remember vividly from 2006 to 2010, that you can wield that legal and political architecture against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Just look at Iran. Iran waited for the lapse of the missile embargo in 2023 to give the Russians the ballistic missiles. It earlier waited for 2022 for the drone one. So clearly these things can have something of an effect. And I think really a clear articulation of this policy, putting resources behind it, and putting, you know, real political capital behind it, can get us in the position to be flexible enough and to drive the Islamic Republic to make a mistake, which, by the way, they tend to do a lot anyway. They're not Kissinger, they're not Bismarck. And then when they make a mistake, you take advantage of it. It really is that simple.
Well, look, I mean, the idea of success, it really comes down to in the eye of the beholder, right? Success for the Iranian opposition would be very different for the Trump administration or others in the United States and elsewhere. But just listening to Alan and Behnam, going back a bit in terms of history, when I look at the almost half a century of Islamic Republic and US wrestling it out, this is how I would sort of very quickly, Negar, bear with me, very quickly, I'll sort of give you my take on it. 79 to about 91, The Ayatollahs have taken American diplomats hostage. They've done all sorts of things the U.S. didn't like, including what they were doing to U.S. Forces in places like Lebanon. A lot of bad blood. What did the United States quietly still do? Try and build bridges with the same Ayatollah Khomeini, because of something bigger happening at the time called the Cold War and the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. My lesson listening to people like Oliver North justifying why Iran was getting American weapons. How did Oliver North justify the Iran-Contra affair? It's not about the Iranians. They're just an important real state. We can't give it to the Russians. And I could go on and give you different stages, but let me just stop here for a second and tell you why I say what I just said about the 1980s. Because we might come to a similar turn of events in terms of power politics around the world today with the rise of China. I mean, we all saw what happened just a few weeks ago in Beijing with the rise of the pretty impressive Chinese military parade. China is a contender to be the sort of thing Soviet Union was for a while. Now, this takes me to what I want to say. How does the Iranian opposition help the United States? Folks like Trump and others who think about the world changing say, I might not care about the Iranian people's human rights. Like Alan said, there are 193 countries. What makes them special? Why should I send my kids to die for their human rights? You can turn around and articulate a different argument. I don't know if Alan said that, by the way. I put some words in your mouth. ببخش من عزیز. So you could... کباب شد. حالا بعداً جواب... So you have to turn around and basically, if I could just be crude about it and forgive me, what's in it for America? And the opposition needs to start thinking, hey, America, do you really want a country of 90 million, the size of Alaska, bang in the Middle East, be sort of essentially a gas station for the Chinese, do as the Russians want, undermining the rest of the Middle East, maybe in South Asia, maybe Eastern Europe? I mean, we have to start thinking along those lines to justify or sell the idea of a different Iran isn't just good for the Iranian people. It's actually in the interest, long-term strategic interest of the United States at a time when we might just enter a new era of decades of rivalry between US and China. You know, I for the life of me, I don't understand why the Chinese don't do more to give the United States a bloody nose when it comes to Iran. The Chinese are sort of almost, I wouldn't say inactive, but they could do more. But here's an opportunity for the United States and the Iranian opposition with the smart folks that it has within it need to start thinking in terms of how do we sell the idea of a new American Iran policy that doesn't just make sense from Iranian opposition or the perspective of the Iranian people, but long-term American strategic interest.
Going back to the point you had at the start of our conversation, it has to be transactional for President Trump as well. So I wanted to ask about, you know, one thing I hear from analysts a lot is Iran is at its weakest point. Iran has been weakened over and over and over again. And it certainly has in terms of its foreign policy, in terms of its proxies, the loss of its greatest Arab ally, Bashar al-Assad. But when it comes to the nation of Iran itself, the regime hasn't collapsed. It's still standing. According to human rights groups, there's been more than 800 executions alone this year. Repression is at an all-time high. That being said, one of the legacies of the Women Life Freedom Movement, there's been a lot of social reforms, a lot of women not wearing the hijab. You see dancing and singing on the streets. And in a way, it's kind of like a controlled freedom, if you will, knowing that something might tip them over the edge or protests may erupt if they try and suppress that as well. So how do you see the state of the Iranian regime right now? Is it really at its tipping point, as people say, or do you see it in another way? Behnam, we'll start with you, then Alan, then Alex. Is it really that weak, is what I mean, in terms of what it means for the people of Iran and not necessarily the foreign policy?
Can I just provide a very quick context?
Yes, please.
Very quick context. In 1986, when my parents sent me away to Europe, they said the regime is a tipping point. And
there you go.
You're going to come back home any minute. So it's, yeah.
Story of all our lives, I think, right?
Is the regime weak? Yes. Is it very, very weak? Yes. My analytical qualm with that is, well, what else is it? It is still lethal, is the problem. And also it still understands, because you asked internally, Negar, how does this impact the Iranian people? It has still made the correct calculation. And you saw that in the analogy that Alex said, that perhaps Khamenei, in his own strategic thinking and martyrology, wouldn't mind being killed by the Israelis rather than fall to the hands of his own people. I think they continue to, unfortunately, make the correct assumption that the greatest threat is from within. And the increasingly limited resources that they have continue to be allocated to dealing with that threat from within. Now they're grossly corrupt, mismanagement and everything. The greatest joke, you guys know better than I, is that even with the rolling blackouts now in Iran, where the government gives you the schedule for the town or the city or the province of the blackouts, the government is so unable, like if you ever want a symbol of incompetence, it is so unable to even show it is in charge that it can't even stick to its own blackout schedule for these provinces in Iran today. So it is exceptionally weak. It is up to both the external and internal drivers of boldening the Iran issue for Western policymakers to be able to capitalize on that weakness. And I count at least 3 to 4 potential drivers. One is the Iranian people themselves, how they react in the face of these weaknesses. Where they are on the strategy of the Islamic Republic trying to render the population afraid with the Basij and Yagana Vijay and the law enforcement forces and Ansar Hezbollah and all the Dastgah Sarkub that they have, or to render the population apathetic. I wouldn't use the word freedom, but the selective hijab enforcement in some parts of town, usually upper to middle class, where it might be a little bit more hands-off, and then in more rural or traditional parts, socioeconomically, less integrated, much more hands-on to show regime loyalists that there still is force, things like that. But also, of course, when it comes to trying to do, and this is a politically charged thing for sure, some of these concerts that they're trying to put out. Render apathetic versus render afraid. This is the regime's strategy to survive at home. Render afraid if they're on the street, to get them off the street. Render apathetic if they're at home, to keep them at home so that they can fight to live another day. I think a mutual friend of many of ours, Ali Ansari in Scotland, said this like I think 2 decades ago, that the Islamic Republic is not a strategist, it's a tactician. It knows how to fight to live another day. It's destroying the country simply by existing. It is destroying the country, but it is ensuring that it can live another day. And that's the challenge of dealing with weak states. Their weapons are weapons of the weak. Countries that have ballistic missiles don't have jets. Countries that tend to have those jets don't have ballistic missiles. Countries that tend to have a normal police force don't have a Basij. They have a Basij and not a normal police force. So their weapons are weapons of the weak. And America actually doesn't have a great track record of dealing long-term with countries that have weapons of the weak, because it doesn't just become a contest of capabilities, it becomes a contest of resolve. And the other constituencies are not just the Iranian people, but the Israelis, the mistakes of the leadership, and potentially the Europeans. And I think the interplay between these 4 will define what crisis at what time is sufficiently emboldened to warrant US involvement. So keep your eyes on these 4 anytime you see blackout, anytime you see something go boom in the Middle East, anytime you see a new statement by Khamenei, because it's the interplay between these 4 that'll will bolden or highlight something of interest for US policymakers. But otherwise, the comments made by everyone else on this panel, unfortunately, I think will continue to bear out.
Alan?
Rephrase the question, please.
In terms of if Iran is at its weakest point, is it at a tipping point right now? Like, what does it mean when they say Iran is weak? What does that mean in the context of Iranian people?
I don't look at it in terms of weak.
Okay.
I look at it in terms of complexity. There's a great book by a guy named Joseph Tainter, The Collapse of Complex Societies. Complexity in a society evolves to deal with problems, okay? As populations get bigger, as resources get more finite, you get complexity. Complexity takes energy, okay? So here's what I see when I look at contemporary Iran, and this is for you, Tozi Vazahat va Tekrar Mukararat. You know all of this stuff, right? Iran is increasingly unable, the Iranian government, the Nizam, is increasingly unable to deliver essential goods and services to an increasing number of its own citizens. That's the fact. Now, societies that do this well get mashrubiat, they get legitimacy. Societies that don't do that well have to rely on coercion to sort of fill the gap. And that's why Iran is so good at coercion, because they stink and are getting worse at delivering these essential goods and services to their people, which at the end of the day is the basic function of any nizam. So they're in this spiral of, if not, destabilization, breakdown, collapse. There is no tipping point. It's like Garden of the Forking Paths. Every moment is a tipping point where a decision sends you down a road you might not necessarily have gone down. But what interests me, what concerns me as we go forward is, as it gets harder, not just for Iran, but in all of the Middle East, where warming is already twice the global average, where you have droughts, where you have desertification, where agriculture is suffering so. As it gets harder and more expensive for Iranians just to get by, does Iran approach asymptotically or more viscerally failed state status? And everyone who's studied Iranian history always knows that's the fear of the people ruling Iran. It's this vociferous decentralization where you lose control of people in the rims, of all the various minorities. This is why Reza Shah, he united Iran. He went south and fought with the Khazalis and did all this stuff we all know about, right? So Iran is very weak right now. And you've heard about, and it's easy, how that manifests in terms of foreign policy. But something more primal, more existentially vital to Iran is what that weakness, that logistical inability means domestically for the vast majority of Iranian citizens who don't track really with granularity the issues that we inside the Beltway focus on, but are more concerned about getting by.
And Alex, you've been hearing this since 1986, your thoughts?
No, when I made the point of 1986, it's just to suggest don't underestimate the regime's capacity to stay in power, because that's been basically the elephant in the room. You underestimate it, and then things don't go forward. I hear what Alan is saying in terms of the socioeconomic conditions. I think it's less and less what they can do in terms of providing the basic services. And I would also go out and say, I think the average Iranian today really expects a lot more than just basic services. Maybe you get away with that in some other countries around the world, but in Iran, I think the aspirations are greater than that. When I listen to not just Iranian Persian language media and commentary in diaspora, but also from Iran, I get a sense of this sense of humiliation, a national humiliation. What happened to us? Why are we here as a country, as a civilization? And again, this is not something that's new to all of you, but what is the number? 70% of Iranians were not born at the time of the revolution, 1979. Mm-hmm. So, if you're sitting in the Islamic Republic and you have to contemplate life after Khamenei, and you have to maybe gamble and not just having repression as your only way of staying in power, then you really have to start listening to some of these hard realities. Some of it's been heard very reluctantly, this idea of not enforcing hijab. I mean, they could have done this years ago. This wasn't a brain surgery. Everyone knows that Iranian society, by and large, hates the idea of enforced hijab on their daughters and wives, daughters, mothers, so forth. But the regime refused. So this is the other part of the regime, that it will essentially compromise. And I give you another example. I'm a big into soccer. For a long time, they wouldn't let women into stadiums. Till the price went to a point where they had to let women into stadiums. So sometimes I do think it's important for us to remember, if the revolution can happen, if you will, and I'm not a reformist, I don't want to say that, but in the absence of action from outside, if we can't do anything collectively, an idea, certainly if you're a policymaker here in Washington, is there any chance for change happening by this regime at its own hands? I mean, Zarifs of this world talk about new paradigm. I don't buy it. Most of us don't buy it. But maybe there are people from this regime post-Khamenei who can maybe do something that, in conjunction with what the diaspora can do, might actually move this thing forward. And again, I know how toxic it is to talk about reformists in Iran. I'm not a supporter of reformists. I think they've done more service for the Khamenei than anybody else. But my point is change from Iran or in conjunction with folks outside. Again, I love the idea of seeking for ways to get people to defect from the regime. What a smart way to do it. How do you do it though? How do you invest in that? It's a smart way of going about it. A lot of people inside this regime, which max has what, 10, 15% support, know this is a sinking ship, but where are they going to jump out onto, right? How do you help them? How do you convince them it's time for you to jump? Again, that goes back to the point we were talking about earlier. What is American or Western, whatever, support. And they need some support if they feel, excuse me, from a transactional point of view, it's worth investing in.
And not to, that they're not necessarily all ideological in that sense as well. So now we're turning into audience questions, and I've been given this little cue card that the audience would like to know about the impact of sanctions. Behnam, we can start with you.
Depends where. Certainly sanctions is like salt in the wound. I think analytically, a better question is how big is the wound? When you look at an economy, a macro economy, like the Islamic Republic of Iran, that already wasn't well integrated to begin with. Well, why are financial sanctions, particularly the stuff the US, the UK, and the EU, back then, 2010 to 2013, the UK was still in the EU, did on the macroeconomic periphery that actually got to cause real macroeconomic damage in Iran. And there's different measures of that success. And Alan remembers in the pre-JCPOA period what those measures of success were, where there was inflation or stagflation, value of the rial relative to the US dollar. No doubt these have damage. But the bridgehead or the beachhead for this to have damage is actually the open sores of the Islamic Republic itself. And if we don't acknowledge that, you are actually making some of the other tools that I'm guessing, based on the parlance of the question, I've been in DC long enough to know what that parlance is, that you may not want headed your way. And if you are trying to deal with and weaken an adversary like the Islamic Republic of Iran, you ought to first use the most non-kinetic, but also the most impactful tools as possible. So certainly when you look at oil exports, when you look at revenues, when you look at the ability of the Islamic Republic to act like an actor on the international stage that is normal and legitimate, sanctions have done a great job. Are they silver bullet? No. Are they the only part of the strategy? No. But they can be like a bus, and this is my pitch for Trump 2.0, that you can take to any destination, particularly some of the destinations that Alan and Alex mentioned. You can take max pressure to a slightly better deal. You can take max pressure to a great deal. You can take it to regime collapse. You can take it to ultimate regime change. You can take it to, and I feel like this is where the administration may take it with the mild enforcement of sanctions that they have right now. You can take it to maintenance, containment, which is actually, if you look at Reagan to Trump, different iterations, different levels of intensity of the same larger strategy, containment. There's been political tools, there's been military tools, but the through line largely over the past 1.5, 2 decades has been economic tools. So it also says a lot about us and about the tools and the time and the risks and the political capital different American presidents have been willing to invest in Iran policy by their reliance, and some would say over-reliance on the sanctions tool.
And what do you think about that, Alex? Has it helped to change Iran's course or behavior in any way? Sanctions.
Can I get a line on the change part?
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Because too often people who are opponents of sanctions would use this to say, okay, well, sanctions don't work. When you are fighting an adversary like the Islamic Republic, with the ideology of the Islamic Republic, with the lethality of the Islamic Republic, you have to understand that when you put this regime, which is not interested in meeting the basic needs of its citizenry that Alan said, when you put this regime to the choice, the normal choice of guns versus butter, it will always pick guns. So in that case, that doesn't mean sanctions failed. That means that the kind of sanctions strategy you have to take is akin to a handicapping strategy. The Islamic Republic is an ideological adversary that is fighting you with two arms. Sanctions success in the medium term, not in the short term, not in the long term, because everyone says we want behavior change with sanctions, but you actually don't always get behavior change with sanctions. Does that mean sanctions failed? No, the Islamic Republic's macroeconomic tracks, it makes it harder for it to keep those threats that it has alive and in business. And ultimately, going back to my fighting analogy, if the Islamic Republic is fighting you with two arms in front, Sanctions allows you to take one of those arms and tie it behind its back. And you see the performance of that in the April, October, and June military exchanges between Israel and Iran.
Alex, what do you think about that fighting analogy?
Look, the sanctions issue, Behnam knows that space much better than I do, given the good work you people do at FDD on that. I think Alan and probably Behnam too would agree. A lot of the suffering has happened at the middle class level in terms of shaping the strategic course of the Islamic Republic. We're still waiting to see. But frankly, if you're the United States, you had to impose sanctions. That's the tool that you have in your toolbox. It's not just limited to Iran. It substitutes for sort of kinetic action. It's better than the others. So it's not a surprise that we put so much emphasis on sanctions. I just say one thing about going forward in terms of sanctions. It can be the policy of the United States just to rely on sanctions, particularly as the world, as we were talking about earlier. You know, when the U.S. was putting sanctions on Iran during the first Obama administration, it shook him to the core, right? Alan can tell you all that from firsthand experience. Today, I'm not saying they're not taking snapback seriously, but they're in a different place. Partly because they've learned to live with sanctions, because they've created a giant network of sanction-busting mechanisms all around the place. And they're not alone in doing that. The war in Ukraine, the Russians, the Chinese, so many players in this. It's not just limited to Iranian players. And we all know where there's money, there are participants. So there's a lot of people involved in this, and it's a big mess for the U.S. to try and track this. I mean, didn't they just put out an award for $15 million to find out what's going on in one of the issues relating to shipping? So I think going forward, if you really want to get Iran's attention, relying on sanctions is not going to cut it. Whether it's kinetic, whether you sit down and have a serious whatever give and take with them. What I'm also saying is the Russias, the Chinas of this world at this point might start looking at Iran file as one that if they lose, it's bad for their prestige. So make America lose with whatever it's trying to do in Iran, make the United States fail. Because if they win there, they're going to replicate it elsewhere, somewhere else. And again, in that context of power politics, it might not be something Beijing and Moscow want to see.
Alan, what do you think, given your experience with the Obama administration?
Sanctions are a tool, and they help you in the job. You know, if you've got a toolkit, it's got more than one tool. You know, what's happened with sanctions over time is you have, you know, we got all the low-hanging fruit first, right? The sanctions that hurt Iran and continue to hurt Iran. And as time goes by and you're sort of playing whack-a-mole as they change companies and change fronts, you modify those sanctions so you can continue to cause Iran economic pain. Those are real sanctions, and they're an essential tool. They're not the only tool in the toolkit, but they're a really good tool. And then we can talk about secondary sanctions, which has its own problems. The sort of sanctions that are suboptimal are the largely performative ones, where the Department of Treasury or State Department, you know, needs to say that they're doing something about the Iranian threat. So they, you know, sanction Ghazanfar or this guy or that guy just because you want to crank out a name and like, we got to show them we're doing something. So let's, you know, this fellow in Shachs who did something, IRGC, terrorism, whatever, put it out. That doesn't really get you anywhere. I mean, it does get you somewhere in the sense that, you know, the bothersome reporter who's going, well, what are you doing about Iran? We sanctioned this company that's a front for this activity. So to the extent that becomes a lazy sort of go-to substitute for thought and action, that bothers me. But historically, sanctions have proven an effective tool to an extent against Iran, with the proviso that, yeah, it's really hurt the middle class, which the ruling elite doesn't care about. And yeah, it's really enriched the ruling elite, which is one of the reasons why I think at least a portion of them prefer to have sanctions stay in place.
And Alan, there is an audience question just for you. Yeah, just for Alan. It's about the U.S. State Department Farsi section. And this individual in the audience had some criticisms. One is lack of proper reporting on extreme human rights violations, lack of proper Farsi speaking staff, and you can see the list as it goes on here. Wanted to get the audience member wants to get your assessment and your viewpoint of the UBC, or the U.S. State Department Farsi section.
Well, there's no Farsi section. There's a Near East Bureau that's got an Iran office. If you're talking about
The social media page, I think they're referring to
the
that.
social media page. So the problem is it's
They say there's lack of reporting on extreme human rights, that they're silent on certain matters, lack of Farsi-speaking staff. They feel
everyone who works there is an Iranian American who speaks fluent Persian. So you can have criticisms about, what is it, USA Farsi, but they all speak Persian, they're all, in terms of what they are not and are doing, I would guess that right now, Persian language media in the U.S. State Department is less active than it used to be at other times. Certainly there's no Persian language spokesperson, not that you need one, though I had a great time doing it. The social media is less active because, again, the U.S. government, the U.S. State Department is less focused on Iran. Okay? We can argue if that's a good or a bad thing. But yeah, it's not a priority. Governments can walk and chew gum at the same time, but they can't do a Rubik's Cube and a jigsaw puzzle at the same time, right? Very limited attention span. You make a good point about inattention. So the U.S. government right now is not focused on Iran, and it certainly doesn't see State Department social media as an effective tool for manipulating the hearts and minds of Iranians.
And our next question from the audience is on a very important topic for all of us here. It's transnational repression. Behnam, I'll ask you this question. A couple of months ago, I was in New York federal court covering the case of 2 Azerbaijani gangsters linked to a Russian mob, Vorzakonya, that were hired by the Iranian regime to kill Iranian-American journalist Masih Alinejad. And that was the first time in court we saw tangible evidence that linked these individuals to the Iranian regime. So what are your thoughts about how serious is the U.S. in combating transnational repression when it comes to Iran?
Well, I think the U.S. is serious. The issue is that it needs to get a lot more serious, and it also needs to adapt with the arc of Iran-backed terrorism. Just step away from the picture when you look at the challenges and the differences between the Sunni side of the street when it comes to foreign terrorism and the Shia side of the street. The Shia side of the street, particularly when you're looking at the Islamic Republic of Iran, benefits from the fact that it has major state patronage. I cannot stress for you enough, when you have a state in international politics taking oil resources, taking the Iranian people's resources and spending it on these things, you can keep these low-cost, low-intensity weapons of the weak alive for so long, and in so doing, keep yourself alive. So that's one of the real challenges. In 1970, I think 1980, the first act of Iran-backed terrorism on U.S. soil took place just in Bethesda, Maryland. If you may recall, they killed exactly a former Shah-era diplomat in his home. It was the guy dressed up as a mailman, if I'm not mistaken. And that was an act of lone wolf terrorism, which we traditionally see from the Shia side of the street. In the ensuing decades, you saw a lot of the stuff that you saw in the Middle East, which was proxy-style terrorism, Hezbollah agents, people tied to the Ministry of Intelligence or Ministry of Information and Security in Iran engaging in these acts of terrorism. For the past decade and a half, 2 decades, we're seeing this new form, which has existed in some ways for non-state actors before, but is more novel when it comes to this state actor. And that is working by, with, and through local transnational criminal syndicates. So rather than send yourself, rather than send your agents, because today Hezbollah is more of a calling card than a way to hide your own hand as the Islamic Republic, you work by, with, and through these transnational criminal syndicates. And in 2010, you saw that, 2011, you saw this, I think, with the attempted assassination of the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C., trying to use Mexican drug cartels. You saw it with the Eastern European and Azerbaijani criminals that Negar just mentioned in the case of Masih Alinejad, and you also saw it in the case of even Canadian biker gangs tied to the Zindashti network, which Treasury in the UK and folks have sanctioned. So this is the new face of Iran-backed terrorism, and the authorities and the political tools and the intelligence tools and the law enforcement tools Western democracies have to keep pace with this evolving face of Iran-backed terrorism. And also, just more recently, kudos to Australia for prescribing the IRGC very recently. the situation they prescribed the IRGC in was not lone wolf, was not proxy. It was a situation involving transnational criminal syndicates, where essentially the Islamic Republic was trying to work through multiple cutouts with existing Australian criminal organizations. So this is actually really fearful, because the calling card now is not, usually it wasn't an Iranian, but it wasn't like a Hezbollah operative or whatever. It is local criminal organizations. And for those of you who are dissidents or advocates or travel, this means simply wider radius of Iran-backed terror and the greater chances of them being able to kill you. So this is an absolutely serious thing that Western policymakers have to take sure that they have the political, law enforcement, and intelligence tools to counter. Because if not, this could be the most hiding in plain sight version of Iran-backed terrorism in 4+ decades.
Yeah, and to add to that, you don't have to be ideological as long as the price is right. Do we have time for actual audience questions with the mic, or we're done? Okay, well, thank you to everyone. And you gave me the best panel, so thanks to the organizers for that. Thanks, guys. You're great. Appreciate it.
زن، زندگی، آزادی.
ملت ایران، ملت ایران، این صدای انقلاب ایران است.
صحبت از ایران، برای ایران.
از مردم برای مردم.
چه باید کرد تا گفتگوی ملی شکل بگیره؟
آیا بدون گفتگوی ملی دموکراسی در ایران ممکنه؟